Let's talk about the 4th house and the 8th house and how to interpret charts where the two of these interact and combine. So let's start off with the 8th house. What is it? It's actually the area of sky that's above the western horizon. And that's why it symbolizes whatever it symbolizes. Essentially, what it symbolizes is the erosion of the west, because that's what the air above the horizon does. It has the rain and the wind that erodes the stuff that's on the ground, evaporates the stuff that's on the ground. So whatever the west represents, the 8th house represents things that are antithetical to it. So the west has to do with invisibility, and the west has to do with death because of the sunset, and the west has to do with other people. And so the 8th house is going to be concerned with these three themes: invisibility, death, and other people, but in a antithetical way. So it will be concerned with invisibility, but concerned with undoing the invisibility. It will be concerned with death, but it's actually more concerned with longevity, or putting off the death or escaping the death. And it'll be concerned with other people, but not by giving to them, rather by getting from them. So let's see a couple of specifics. The 8th house, for example, is famous for being the house of secrets, particularly for knowing secrets or discovering secrets. And this is why it's famous as a house for mysticism, occult, astrology, psychology, and all that kind of stuff. Understanding things that are invisible, understanding things that people don't see. And this is why it's a house for critique or analysis, because it has to do with getting past the facade, seeing the truth, seeing the inner workings, cracking something open and getting into it. So it's a skeptical house. It's a house that assumes that things are lies, let's say, or it assumes that things are fake or not real or not what they seem, and it goes into the heart of it. Also, because the 8th house erodes death, this is why it's famous as the house of life force or vitality or longevity. And also, this is why it's the house for sexuality, because sexuality is what generates life. It generates vitality, and it generates children, which is going to put off death. And that's what the 8th house is all about, how to evade death or put it off. So one way to do it is by having kids and reproducing. As a species, this makes the species immortal, and the other way to do it is to generate vitality that makes you immortal, or at least live longer. So the 8th house generates vitality, and it generates the sexual stuff, the sexual drives and so forth, the sexual organs. Also, the 8th house has to do with other people in terms of what you get from them. So it's a house for inheritance, especially inheritance, because it also has to do with death and invisibility. So getting money from things that you don't see. But in general, it just has to do with getting money from other people. So getting gifts, or also just getting money as a result of being in a relationship with somebody else. And it also has to do with sales, getting people's money. And so in this way, since the 8th house is also involved with secrets, it also could be a deceptive house, because it could use secrets to its advantage. So that's a basic summary of the 8th house. This video, we don't really want to go into specifically what the 8th house is, but rather how it works with the 4th house. So that's good enough for now. And now let's take a look at what the 4th house is, and then let's look at how the 4th and 8th would interact. The 4th house literally is the ground directly below our feet. And that is why it symbolizes what it symbolizes. It symbolizes everything that's under the surface, inside, unseen, the inner self. So it deals with emotions, the inner part of a person. This is why it's the house for happiness, so the quality of your emotions. This is why it's the house for devotion. In other words, your motivation for an action. And the emotional person is signified by the 4th house. So it's an archetypical female or sensitive being. So archetypical female has to do with mother. And the mother is really the one who has the biggest emotional impact on the child. Not the only emotional impact, but the biggest one, or she should, archetypically. So this is why the fourth house represents femininity in general, motherhood, love, devotion, happiness, mental health. Because it's about emotions in general, because it's the house that's under the ground, so it signifies what's inside of us. Secondly, if it's under the ground, it means things you can't see, so it means privacy. This is why the house signifies shyness or modesty. And this is why it signifies your home, because your home is your private spot. And not just your home, but all of your private property that's inside the home. And the fourth house is very important to understand how well you sleep. So the fourth house shows the restfulness, the peacefulness, the quietude, and the ability to sleep. Another thing about the fact that it's underground, it's where the roots go. So the fourth house signifies anything connected to the roots, and this means your stability, how stable you are, how strong of a foundation you have, and your ancestry, your family background, or your culture. So again, it's not a video about the fourth house, so that's good enough for now. What we really want to do now is see the chemistry that happens when you take the fourth house and combine it with the eighth. Now, you might be thinking, how do you combine a house with another house? The simple way to do it is through the lords of the house. So if the lord of the fourth house, for example, goes into the eighth house, or if you have the eighth lord in the fourth house, or if you have the eighth lord and the fourth lord joining somewhere, or if you have the eighth lord and the fourth lord mutually aspecting each other, then you, via the lords, get these houses to combine. Another very important way that houses can combine is in terms of how prominent they are. If they're sequential in their prominence, then they'll be working together in the life. So for example, if the fourth house is the most prominent and then the eighth is the next most prominent, or if the eighth is the most prominent and the fourth is the next, or if they're on opposite sides of the prominence spectrum, then these two houses work together. Now, it's easy to look at a chart and see where the lords are and see if the lords combine, but it's difficult to know the prominence order of the houses. It takes a lot of astrological knowledge to be able to calculate that. So I have a report that does it for you. And if you want to see that report, go to my website, victorcara.com. You can add a /H if you want to go directly to the report. Otherwise, look for the report called The Houses of Life. And you'll get a whole bunch of interesting stuff about calculations about the houses. But what's particularly useful in terms of this video is you'll get this DNA code, which is this prominent sequence of your house. Now that we know how the fourth and the eighth could combine, let's talk about how we would interpret the combination of the fourth and the eighth. And I want to do it a little bit different this time by naming some people who have 4 and 8 combinations first, before we look at the theory of 4 and 8. This way it might be easier to continuously keep putting a face on the theory. So Marilyn Monroe is one person. And then Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, those 2 artists. And then we have 2 authors, famous authors, Hermann Hesse and Charles Bukowski. Then we have 2 politicians, Benito Mussolini and Joe Biden. Then we have 2 serial killers, Richard Ramirez and Ted Bundy. And then we have 1 person who is making the video for you right now, me. So bear these people in mind as you hear the theory of the 4th and 8th house combination. The first element of the theory is that there's a basic clash between 4 and 8. Because the 4th house is basically happy or deals with happiness, but the 8th house is basically dissatisfied or unhappy, and that's why it's critical or analytical or looking for more, looking for something that's not obvious. So there's a basic clash between the 8th house being fault-finding or dissatisfied, but the 4th house being accepted and happy, being accepting and happy. And so interpret combinations between 4 and 8 to indicate unhappiness, unfortunately. So look at some of the people on the list: Marilyn Monroe, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Hermann Hesse, Charles Bukowski, and you can see it. These people have kind of either they're hiding some kind of depression like a Marilyn Monroe, or they have a sort of a darker tone to them, or they're just sad or angry or something. So the reason for the unhappiness is very interesting. The reason is because of the critical nature of the 8th house interacting with the accepting nature of the 4th. So the unhappiness results from not being able or willing to accept happiness and its sources. We'll have a critical attitude towards happiness itself and a critical attitude towards sources of happiness. And that critical attitude undermines our relationship with those sources of happiness. So, for example, the mother, the family, the community, the property, the 4th, 8th house combination native will feel like this thing is not that important, really. This thing has flaws. I don't need this thing so much. I can leave my mother. I can leave my family. I don't need this community. I don't need this property. It has flaws to it. There's stuff that's better. I should try for something better. But then, as a result, they lose those sources of security, stability, and happiness. Another super important thing when thinking about 4th and 8th house is to realize their relationship to secrets or the invisible or the unknown. They both have to do with unseen things, but in opposite ways. The 4th house is interested in preserving a secret or keeping a secret. The 8th house is interested in exposing a secret. So there's actually a clash, even though they're both on the page about secrecy or invisibility. They are both going about it in different ways. And so the result is a complication regarding secrecy or a complication regarding privacy. So there'll be an obsession with secrets. Like, look at Marilyn Monroe, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Herman Hesse. Look at the people that are on the list. So it can lead to dealing with things that are supposed to be unseen or should be unseen, like illegal things or forbidden things or taboo things. Private things like sex can be overemphasized. Mysterious things can be overemphasized so people can get involved in cults, subcultures, underground things, and occult. And again, it works with the previous dynamic that we discussed. So the interest in these obscure things is what causes the devaluation of the more conventional things of the 4th house. And that's what causes the lack of stability and lack of emotional happiness. And finally, there's one more thing that's quite important about 4 and 8. The 4th has to do with mothering, and the 8th has to do with reproduction. So they're on the same page here, but the 8th is actually a masculine attitude towards reproduction. It's virility. How virile or how potent you are. Vitality, virility, potency. Whereas the 4th is feminine, it's nurturing, it's gestation. So although they're on the same page, there's a bit of a clash, which is interesting. It results in the feminization of sexuality, to have the 4th and the 8th connected. Now, that will mean something different for a male than it will mean for a female. If the male has a 4th and 8th house combination, you will get something called effeminateness, or there'll be a timidity to the sexuality. They won't have the confidence or the aggressiveness of a male, or there'll be a complexity to it. They'll get hung up on it, they'll get overly obsessed with it. If it's in the female, however, as you can see with the only female on this list, Marilyn Monroe, it will work for a female to feminize the sexuality in a female. Makes no complications. It makes things simple and strong. But to feminize the sexuality in a male makes some complications. Looking at these baseline interpretations and looking at the names on the list, there's a couple of questions. Literally a couple. There's 2 big questions I feel I have. Is like Joe Biden doesn't really seem to fit. He seems to be the odd one out in this group. Everybody else has some kind of big gigantic secret or some darkness to them. But Joe Biden seems like a pretty simple, plain, not exactly party guy, but not really depressed or anything either. So he seems to be a question mark. And the other one is Mussolini. Mussolini seems to fit a lot of the stuff really well, but when it comes to the third thing, mothering versus reproduction and the feminization of sexuality and the timidification of masculinity, he's exactly the opposite. There's probably nobody in recent history who's more uber macho than Benito Mussolini. So I want to investigate these two questions. First of all, let's look at Joe Biden. He doesn't really match the basic interpretation, and we want to find out why. Here's his chart. Now, as you can see, Joe Biden is coming up as a match for a 4-8 combo because he has the 4th Lord in the 8th house. So the things that I'm going to talk about here are relative to that. Looking at this chart will lead us to notice a few important things that are ubiquitous to anyone with a Sagittarius ascendant. The Sagittarian ascendant tends to resist a lot of these implications of the 4-8 combo because the 4th Lord is Jupiter. Jupiter will resist becoming dark because Jupiter's nature is to be bright and positive. And Jupiter will also resist devirilification because Jupiter is for reproduction. For Sagittarius ascendant, if the 4th Lord is in the 8th house, it's exalted. So if the 4th Lord is exalted, that resists negative implications. And then also for Sagittarian ascendant, the 4th Lord is actually the 1st Lord. And it's primarily the 1st Lord because the Mul Trikon, or the root domicile, is Sagittarius for Jupiter. So the prominent thing, when the 4th Lord is in the 8th house, it'll be more prominent to have the 1st Lord in the 8th house. And so that goes some distance to explaining why Joe Biden doesn't really seem to fit in the rest of these names. One reason is because he's a Sagittarian ascendant. There's other things that are quite important about him in particular. He has the 1st Lord Jupiter exalted, and he has a bright and exalted moon. So when you have your 1st Lord exalted and your moon bright and exalted, it is very difficult to do anything else in that chart that is going to screw it up or make it dark or make it problematic, because the two pillars and foundations of the chart are so good. And in his case, these two pillars are not even tangential or tucked out of the way somewhere. They're very primary in the chart. They're super influential. His Jupiter is aspecting all those planets in Scorpio, and his moon is aspecting all those planets in Scorpio. And both of them have a pretty significant aspect even on the ascendant. So this is going to really put a mute on the interpretations of 4 and 8, bringing about unhappiness or dissatisfaction or mistakes in how you evaluate what's worthwhile and what's not worthwhile. Additionally, he has the 6th house moon, and he has a Saturn that can aspect the ascendant. So that's going to mute what I would call the impracticality of 4 and 8. 4 and 8 combinations lead a person to value impractical things or invisible things or idealistic things or mystical or spiritual things. But Biden has a very practical chart. He's got Saturn influencing the ascendant, and he's got the moon in the 6th house. So that's going to mute the impracticality of 4 and 8. So this shows why Biden doesn't match the interpretation, even though he does have the 4th Lord in the 8th house. And this shows in a more general way, what this is showing us is don't just pick one thing about a chart and think that you can read the individual just from that one thing. You always have to look at the actual chart and take everything into account. Now let's take a look at Mr. Mussolini. He matches most of this stuff very, very well, but except he's really the opposite on terms of effeminate. So he's hyper macho, and why is that? Here's his chart. I can even already see something I didn't see before. All the planets are above ground. That's a masculine indicator. There's something here to note about Scorpio in general. Because for Scorpio, if the fourth lord is in the 8th house, which once again, like Joe Biden, this is how he's coming up as a match for 4 and 8, because he has a fourth lord in the 8th house. For Scorpio, the fourth lord is also the third lord. So if a Scorpio ascendant has the fourth lord in the 8th house, then they also have the third lord in the 8th house, and the third lord in the 8th house is quite different from the fourth lord in the 8th house, especially on the topic of libido and virility. It will really be pro-virility and pro-masculinity. So that's just for Scorpio. And then for him in particular, like I said, all of his planets are above ground. And another general thing about him is he only has 3 signs occupied by real planets. That creates Shula Yoga, which is very aggressive yoga, very masculine yoga. His 8th lord is consumed by the sun in Leo. So the 8th lord is important because this whole thing is about the 4-8 combination. So the 8th lord is important. The 8th lord is consumed. It's absolutely combust by the sun, who's the most virile figure. And it's in Leo, which is the most virile sign. So that is going to, again, completely contradict the idea that he's going to be effeminate. And his moon, which is also in the 8th house, so it's also quite significant to this topic. His moon is flanked by Saturn on one side and Mars on the other side. These are hard planets, and Mars is very masculine. So to have the moon flanked by malefics in the 8th house, do not expect the person to be soft, non-aggressive, non-masculine in their sexual outlook. Quite the opposite. And finally, his 3rd house, which is the secondary source for virility and libido, with the 8th, it's 3 and 8. The 3rd house is powered up because it has the aspect of Mars, Jupiter, and Venus. Jupiter is the planet for reproduction, Venus is the planet for fertility, and Mars is the planet for lust. And particularly Mars aspecting Capricorn, his 3rd house, is very powerful. So actually, Benito Mussolini, even though he has the 4th lord in the 8th house, it's obvious that he has extreme masculinity in his sexual outlook or in his gender. Now, don't forget, this is just based on 4th lord and 8th house. It's also equally or more important to see the prominence of the houses. If you want to know what your house prominences are, then just a reminder, you can get that report from my website at victorcarrera.com/H, and there's also a lot of other stuff that you'll get in that report that's quite fascinating and interesting and you can't get elsewhere. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time for the 4th and 9th house combinations.